There came a morning when I walked into the company I had built and realized the company did not need me to walk in. The production was running. The orders were being fulfilled. The wages were being paid. The machines were doing what the machines were designed to do, managed by the people, hired and trained to manage them, inside the systems built specifically so that one man's presence or absence on any given morning changed nothing about the output. That morning was not an accident. It was the result of a specific set of decisions I had been making for years, and most of those decisions were the opposite of what felt right at the time I made them. I want to tell you exactly what those decisions were, because what I built that morning was already running, and I want you to understand precisely how it was built and what you need to build the same thing in your own situation. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from 2 failed companies and a very specific understanding of what the difference is between a man who works and a man whose work runs without him. That difference is not luck. It is not a special kind of intelligence. It is a design, and design is learnable. Stay with me. Listen to this every day. The first time you hear it, it will sound like a description of something other people do. By the 3rd time, it will start to sound like a description of something you could build. Most people who want financial freedom think about it in terms of the number. If I earned more, they think, I would be free. The number they are currently earning is insufficient. A larger number would be sufficient. So they work toward a larger number. They get it. The larger number funds larger consumption. The consumption expands to meet the number, and the position they are in is structurally identical to where they were before the number grew. Still trading hours for money, still requiring their presence for the income to continue, still one serious illness or one bad decision away from the number stopping and the consumption having nowhere to go. Structure is the problem, not the number. And the structure of almost every working life is built around the exchange of personal time for personal income, which means the income is dependent on the time being available. Time is finite. Time decreases with age. A structure built entirely on the exchange of finite, decreasing time for income has a ceiling, and the ceiling lowers as the years pass. What I built was a different structure. Not one where I stopped working. I worked intensely for more years than most men, but the structure of the work changed. In the early years, I was the work. My presence, my decisions, my hands on the problems. Remove me and the operation slowed or stopped. That is the first structure, and it is the structure almost everyone builds by default, because it is the structure that feels most direct and most controllable. You want something done right, you do it yourself. You want it done consistently, you stay involved. The logic is sound and the outcome is a trap, because you have built something that requires you, which means you and the thing you built are bound together, and neither is free. Building the second structure took me years, and I almost did not build it. And that I almost did not build because the transition from the first to the second is deeply uncomfortable in ways I want to describe honestly. In the second structure, the systems do the work. The people run the systems. The systems are designed specifically so that any capable person, properly trained, can operate them without requiring the original builder's judgment on every decision. The builder's role shifts from doing to designing, then from designing to overseeing, then from overseeing to owning. At each stage, the builder is less necessary to the daily operation. At the final stage, the operation runs, and the builder may be present or absent, and the output is the same. At that final stage is what I mean when I say the money arrives without the work, not that no work was done. Enormous work was done, over years, to build the system to that point, but the work that was done is now residing in the system rather than in the builder's continued presence. The system runs. The system produces. The income is the consequence of the system's production, not of the builder's daily effort. Here is the specific place where this becomes practically applicable and stops being description. The transition from structure 1 to structure 2 requires a specific decision at a specific point. And almost everyone refuses the decision because it feels like the wrong thing to do. The decision is to let something run less well than you could run it personally, in order to build the capability in the system to run it without you. When I began giving responsibilities to managers and supervisors rather than handling the decisions myself, the decisions were worse for a period. Not catastrophically worse, but measurably less precise than the decisions I would have made. A man in the first structure corrects this by taking the decisions back. He returns to being the one who handles it, the work improves, and he has just rebuilt the trap. I made a different choice. I accepted the period of worse performance as the cost of building the capability in the system, worked to improve the system rather than replace the system with my own presence, and discovered that within a reasonable period, the system's decisions were nearly as good as mine, and then as good, and then in some specific areas better, because the people making the decisions were the people with their hands on that specific part of the work every day, which I was not. Vulnerability in that transition is real, and I want to name it rather than pretend it was easy. There is a specific kind of fear that arrives when you hand a critical responsibility to a system or a person and walk away from it. The fear is not irrational. Things can go wrong. Things did go wrong. There were losses during the transition period that would not have happened if I had remained the decision maker. I knew this at the time and made the choice anyway, because the alternative was to remain permanently bound to the daily operation, which is the alternative that costs everything in the long run, even when it costs nothing in the short run. Pay the transition cost. Let the system develop the capability at the cost of some short-term performance. The short-term performance loss is the price of the long-term structural change. It is a price worth paying. Almost no one pays it because almost no one can tolerate the feeling of performing below their own capability deliberately. That specific intolerance is the wall between Structure 1 and Structure 2, and it keeps most capable people in Structure 1 permanently. There was a man I knew during the early years of building the company, a machinist and foreman named Walter, who was, by any standard I could apply, the most capable operational man I had in the facility during those years. Walter could run any machine in the place. He understood the production sequence better than anyone. When a problem appeared, Walter solved it faster and more accurately than the system I was trying to build could solve it. Every metric pointed to Walter being the most valuable person in the operation. Walter never built anything beyond the operation he was running. 20 years later, Walter was still running the same kind of operation, with his hands on the same kinds of problems, earning a good wage and respected by everyone who worked with him. The operation depended on Walter. Without Walter, the operation had a serious problem, and Walter, knowing this, knowing how much the operation needed him, found the need flattering rather than alarming. He was too valuable to the daily operation to invest the time in making himself unnecessary to it. He was so good at being inside the machine that he never built the machine to run without him. Walter retired with his savings and his reputation and the respect of the people who had worked with him. What Walter did not have was a Walter independent operation that continued generating output after Walter left. When Walter left, the value Walter had been creating left with him, because Walter had been the system rather than building the system. Between Walter and the builder I became, the difference is not talent. Walter had more raw talent than I did in several specific areas. The difference is a single decision made repeatedly over years, whether to solve the problem personally or build the system that solves the problem without me. Now, let me be specific about what building a self-running system actually requires, because the concept without the specific components is inspiration without application. The first component is documentation. Every process that currently lives in your head or in the hands of one person needs to exist as a written description that a trained person who has never seen it before can follow and produce an adequate result. Not a perfect result, an adequate result. Perfect results are what you produce when you are doing it yourself. Adequate results are what the system produces while it is still developing the capability for better results. Document every repeatable process. This is tedious work. It is the foundational work that makes everything else possible. The second component is people whose capability you develop rather than tasks you perform. A person who can perform a task because you trained them and built a system around the task is a unit of your productive capacity that exists outside your own time. Every such person is a multiplication of what you can produce beyond what your personal hours allow. The builder of a self-running system spends time developing people and building systems around their developed capabilities. The builder of a personal operation spends time performing the tasks at the highest quality available, which is their own. The third component is the financial structure that captures the output of the system rather than the output of your hours. Some people use the phrase income without presence to describe this, and the phrase is accurate as far as it goes. The income continues without your active presence, but the building that produced that quality was not passive at all. What it requires structurally is that the income generated by the system flows to you as an owner of the system rather than as a worker in the system. The distinction is everything. A worker in a system earns wages. An owner of a system receives the system's output minus its operating costs. The worker's income stops when the worker stops. The owner's income continues when the owner stops, because the system continues and the system is what the income comes from. Here is the practical exercise I want you to do after this message ends. Write down every recurring task in your current work or building that requires your personal involvement. List everything, every decision, every process, every communication, every piece of work that stops or degrades if you are not there. Then look at the list and ask one question about each item. What would it take to build a system or develop a person who could handle this adequately without me? Not perfectly, adequately. The answer for each item is either a document, a trained person, a defined process, or some combination of these. The list of what it would take is the list of what the building requires. Doing this exercise surprises people in two ways. The first is how many of the items on the list are there, because the person never built the system to handle them, not because the items actually require that person's unique capability. The second is how short the list becomes when you remove the items that could be handled by a document and a trained person. What remains after the shortening is the actual core that requires you, usually a much smaller set of things than the full operational involvement most people are carrying, reduced to the core. Build systems around everything else. Develop people to run the systems. Document the processes so the people can run them consistently. This is the work that builds structure 2 out of structure 1. It is not glamorous work. It is methodical, patient, ungrateful feeling work, because you are building the mechanism for your own removal from daily necessity. The mechanism, once built, is the most valuable thing you will ever own, more valuable than any wage, more valuable than any single act of production, because it produces without requiring the production to be performed again by you personally every day. The morning I described at the beginning, the morning the company was running without me needing to walk in, was not freedom in the sense of having nothing to do. I still worked. I still thought about the building constantly. But the work I did that morning was chosen rather than required. I worked on the things I chose to work on because they interested me, not on the things the operation demanded of me to keep running. That is the specific quality of the freedom that the self-running system produces, not absence of work, chosen work. Escaping work entirely was not what I was building toward. That was not what I was building toward, and it is not what I would recommend building toward. Work that you choose, in the direction you choose, at the pace you choose, on the problems you find genuinely worth solving, that is not something to escape from. That is something to build toward. The self-running system is the mechanism that makes the work chosen rather than required. Everything else about it is a consequence of that shift. Second exercise. Identify one thing in your current building that you have been handling personally because you are better at it than the system would be. One thing. Then spend the next 2 weeks building the system that handles it adequately without you. Document the process. Train one person in the document. Let them run it for 2 weeks and do not intervene. At the end of 2 weeks, evaluate what was lost and what was gained. The loss will be some precision. The gain will be the knowledge that the thing can run without you, which is the first concrete evidence that structure 2 is buildable in your specific situation. one system component at a time. The full self-running operation was not built in one decision. It was built through 100 decisions, each one transferring one more thing from personal performance to systemic operation. The compound effect of 100 such transfers across years is the morning I described, the morning the whole thing runs, and your presence is optional. Your version of that morning exists at the end of the building. The building begins with the first transfer. Come back to this every day until the building is further along than when you first heard it. Subscribe and come back for what's next.